Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with housing advocate Leigh Bursey and also Ray Sullivan, who's the executive director of the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association. Gentlemen, I just want to continue on what we were talking about the fact that politicians are starting to play heed to housing and homelessness issues, perhaps more than ever before. Leigh, what's your perspective on this?
Well, I was a municipal councillor for 3 terms, 11 years of my life, and got elected while I was still a student leader, talking about student housing issues and student affordability issues. And as someone with some lived experience of homelessness and someone who is very familiar and very passionately intertwined with many housing insecure people who I have great affinity for and care deeply about, this is not a new issue for me. But what I can say is that sitting in some of those council chambers and having those discussions at other times in history, I know that they were often referred to, or diminutively, they were referred to almost as niche market issues. A lot of left-wing conversations about social justice and about, social safety net conversations that many times were pushed off as special interest political ideologies. And what I'm seeing is that's not necessarily accurate, and that's not necessarily how it's being viewed or conveyed or perpetuated at this time in history. Right now, we have voices who would notoriously not be part of this discussion 10 years ago, no longer seeing it as a special interest, but as a lifeline and necessity. And I think that is a very interesting moment. As the chair of the advocacy committee with CHRA and working with Ray quite closely, not long ago, I made the point that I can't remember a time since this has been my rally cry. This has been my part of, the world, my life, my life's work. I can't remember a single time where it's been the first, second, and or third polling issue across the country in almost every major poll, often accompanied by healthcare, and often accompanied by food security, and often accompanied by the cost of living, right, all of which are completely entangled with this particular issue. And I think that says, I would like to say on an idealistic level that maybe if we had been listening to some of those niche market voices, those special interest groups that were being marginalized and oftentimes denigrated in this discussion previously, maybe we wouldn't be looking at this very same shift in the pendulum today.
Right.
But regardless of that, as long as I'm no longer interested in it being my name attached to it, I will happily engage with anyone who wants to talk about these issues and wants to put firm action towards them, because the reality is that it's do or die for many, and the reality is so many people are struggling, and it's no longer can we or should we, but that we have to, and that we should, and we need to.
Right. Ray Sullivan, you referenced this before the break. Obviously, the CHRA very focused on many issues, but obviously community housing as being part of it. So you've stressed the need for more community housing. Can you elaborate on how that would work and why it's necessary?
Yeah, and this is part of the perfect storm that we're facing right now that is swamping folks when it comes to housing. And it's nice to hear, certainly at the federal level, recognition from the government, from the opposition, that this is the result of bad decisions made by successive governments of all colors and stripes over the past 3 decades. Go back 30, 35 years ago, 15 to 20% of all housing starts were non-market housing, co-op and nonprofit housing. Starting with the federal government in the early 1990s, there was a withdrawal from that space. So a massive reduction in the investment in co-op and nonprofit housing. At the same time, there were shifts in tax and accounting policies at the national level that made it less viable for the private market to continue building rental housing. So we had this huge drop-off in rental housing, both market and non-market, from the early 90s, really until about 6 or 7 years ago, when things started to turn around a tiny bit, but nowhere near at the level that we had from the late 80s and the early 90s. So we've got a massive supply problem generally across the housing market. We've got a very specific supply problem when it comes to rental housing. And it's 30 years worth of supply that we have to somehow try to catch up on.
Right.
This is fueling the rapid increase in rents. And the rapid increase in rents is really creating financial incentives for landlords to displace their current tenants because under most jurisdictions, they can rapidly increase the rents when the apartment turns over and a new tenant comes in. So
Right.
one of the solutions that we're proposing is federal support to help nonprofits and co-ops buy existing market rental housing, many of which are under rent controlled conditions, renting at reasonably affordable levels, stabilize those rents under nonprofit ownership, protect and secure those tenancies, and stop that hole in the bottom of the bucket where we're losing the supply of affordable housing.